Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Today I thought I'd share with you my top picks for autumnal palettes. So I'm going to go through kind of the palettes that I think are the most autumn appropriate, the most autumnal color stories that I have. This was actually the hardest one I've done so far. I've done this every season so far this year, and this is the hardest one I've done. Well, I guess maybe the easiest one because I had so many palettes I wanted to pick. Yeah, I had a hard time narrowing it down to 5. And I actually don't have 5, I have 6 palettes, but one of them is kind of like a bonus palette. And I'll talk about that when I get to that palette. But before I do so, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. Let's jump into the video. So let's actually start with the one that has a bonus palette connected to it, and my first pick for autumnal palette is my Subculture palette by Anastasia. This palette is very kind of autumnal shades, it's quite deep, it's quite grungy, and this is definitely an autumnal palette in my collection. This palette I've only had in my collection for about 2 years now, so not too long. It's been around for way longer than that, but I mean this is definitely the quintessential kind of autumnal palette. It has a lot of like I said, like grungy tones, like grey tones, and these kind of autumn leaves kind of shades. And yeah, I just think this is a really good autumnal palette. It's not something that I reach for every single day because it does create very grungy, very deep kind of looks. Even the shades in here that look a bit more colourful pull very deep on the eyes, apart from, you know, more the yellow tones and this peachy tone. Those are a bit lighter, but you know, Axis, Roxy, All Star, Destiny, Untamed, all of those are very kind of deep on the eyes. So it is a very autumnal grungy kind of color story, so that is my first pick. And like I said, with that we have like a kind of like a bonus palette, and that is my At First Sight palette from Colourpop, because this one I feel like I have a very similar color story. Let me see if I can hold these up together. So here they are together. I feel like they are, like I said, very similar color stories. They're not exact, but they do have very similar shades. This kind of transition shade here isn't quite in the Subculture palette. We have Fudge, which is slightly bit deeper, but we do have like a mustard shade. We have like a red toned shade kind of like this. This shade I guess is more similar to Roxy, but Roxy is a bit more peachy. This shade here is somewhat similar to Electric. This one is not in this palette either. But then we have a deep brown, we have a purple shade, we have that green, which is similar to Destiny. We have Emerald City, which is similar to Untamed. We have P and W, which is similar to Axis. And then we have like a deep kind of purplish black with sparkle in it, which I guess is similar to Rowdy. So I feel like these are very similar color stories, but I would say that At First Sight is the less grungy version of Subculture. So if you have one or the other, I wouldn't say you have to need both, but I just want to mention this one too if you do have this one instead of Subculture, because honestly I feel like these color stories are very similar. So while we mention Colourpop, let me talk about the next palette, which is the Through My Eyes palette. This is probably one of my most underrated palette, I would say. I really love this palette, but I don't feel like many people talk about this. I don't even know if you can pick this one up anymore, but I think that this is a very autumnal palette. But it's a little bit kind of brighter, not as grungy as the last two I just showed you, but it does have the same kind of autumnal shades, like the kind of plummy, really grungy shades done in this corner. This corner here has more kind of emerald shades, more kind of jewel toned. It has a mauve tone, which is really nice as well. And this palette can seem very overwhelming, but if you look at this as like quads, I feel like it's very kind of like makes sense. Like this quad here, this quad here, this here, this here, but you can even do like the center shades. It's a very nice, well-built palette in my opinion. We have like a red shade, we have some like golden tones, some like yellowy orangey tones, and overall I think this again is a very autumnal palette, but it isn't as grungy as the last two, and it also has a more kind of neutral shades, so you can build those neutral tones. And yeah, like for example this shade here is absolutely stunning, the orangey kind of sparkly shade. So yeah, I do love this palette a lot, and as you can see I've gotten a lot of use out of this palette, so this is definitely a palette I'm going to pull out and play with more in the upcoming months. I have one more Anastasia palette, and that is my Jackie Aina palette. This one is one that I was considering whether to put in my kind of autumnal shades or my wintry shades, but especially like thinking at this corner here, isn't that like the most kind of autumnal little 6-pan you've ever seen? Like I think that's like the quintessential kind of autumnal shades. So yeah, definitely that. And then it has like some more kind of jewel tones again, which are very autumn. I feel like these purples make it slightly more wintry, and that's kind of why I considered putting it in that category. But overall, it's a more kind of a unique autumn palette, I would say. So I would say if you don't necessarily love kind of warm toned, like orangey toned, burnt oranges, like those ready toned, if you don't necessarily like those autumnal shades, I would say this is a really good option, because if you cover up those shades again, this part of the palette is more kind of cool tone, but it still has that richness that I feel like people connect with autumn, but it's just a different take on it. So a very kind of versatile palette. Is a very good quality palette as well. I think a lot of people say that this is one of the best palettes quality wise that Anastasia have made, and I agree with that. It's really nice, and again, I'm definitely going to play around with this loads in the upcoming months. So next up we have the newest palette on this list for me, and that is my Mountain Trail palette from Sydney Grace. I actually got this free with a purchase I made for their Christmas in July sale, and this is what this one looks like. It's such a beautiful palette, and this is a palette that I was actually considering purchasing anyway, even before it was like I mean, it got released as like promo kind of. You could pick it up either on its own, or you could have it as a gift with purchase. So I was always gonna get that gift with purchase, but even if it wasn't a gift with purchase, I would consider buying this on its own, because I think it's a beautiful color story, and it's like the perfect kind of grungy warm toned greens, which I think are very autumnal. So I wanted to include this because it is a bit different than some of the other palettes that I mentioned, although the next one I'm going to mention also has a few green tones in it. But I think this palette is beautiful, and the Sydney Grace formula is absolutely stunning. So if you haven't tried any Sydney Grace before, I definitely recommend it. And yeah, I think this is the type of greens that you can wear that look a bit more neutral. So if you are scared of wearing greens, I think these tones will definitely be more wearable. And since it has a bit more kind of brown to them, yeah, you can definitely reach for these more on an everyday basis. I have actually reached for these tones a lot for like the office and things like that, and I have actually reached for this palette that way as well. And I haven't played around with this too much. I haven't even used all the shades yet. I have used majority of them, but yeah, I'm definitely going to play around with this more in the upcoming months, because it is super autumnal and I love these tones. So the last palette I'm going to talk about is the one that I think is the most autumnal palette in my collection. This is the one that I always think of when I think of my most autumnal palettes, and that is my Anastasia Metropolis palette. I'm not quite sure if you can get this anymore or not. I think it was supposed to be limited edition, but I think she kept it around for longer than they planned originally. But this is what this palette looks like. So like I said, it has a bit more of those kind of green tones I just mentioned, but not as many. Then it does also have these kind of more warm toned orangey tones. So you can see some red, just neutral browns, and it's the perfect kind of middle of the road autumnal palette. I feel like in here you get everything you could ever want for an autumnal look. It doesn't really have quite those tones as the Jackie Aina palette did, like those more jewel tone, like purpley rich tones, but it does have like some blue tones, which I think would like works for autumn as well. And overall I love this. I pull this out and play with every single autumn, and I don't have enough use in this. I have one pan in here, but that is from I think my Panos eyeshadows, and I do have a couple dips as you can see, but I do need to get more use on this palette because it's my favorite. I love this so much. This and the gold palette is definitely my top two palettes from Anastasia. I think the formula is amazing. This is definitely one of the better ones. If you do have the gold palette, I wouldn't say the formula is quite as good, because that is consistent throughout the whole palette. This one does have a few shades that aren't as good, but overall it's such a stunning palette, and I absolutely love this. And if you do have this in your collection, please pull it out. It is an expensive palette, and it deserves a lot of love. So that is my last pick for an autumn palette. So those were my top picks for autumnal palettes. So if you want some inspiration on what kind of palettes to pull out this time of year, you can get some inspiration from these palettes. If you have any of those, I definitely recommend you pull them out. And if not, let me know what your favorite fall palette is down below. I would love to know, because again, I had way more that I wanted to pick. Like, I mean, my Beauty Bay Wilderness palette is a really good pick if you have that as well. I feel like the tones are a little bit more kind of brighter, and there's no mints and stuff in there too, so I feel like it could pull more kind of summery, so that's why I didn't pick that one. And again, that's kind of a similar color story to the Subculture and the At Foresight. Not quite exactly the same, but it has like the kind of spread that they do. And also a couple more that I was thinking about, but yeah, those are probably the top ones that I chose between. So yeah, it was really difficult to pick palettes for this round, so let me know if you have any other autumnal palettes that you think of in your collection that is like your top pick for the season. And otherwise, I really hope you're having a lovely day wherever you are, and I will catch you in my next one. Bye guys.